Here's your slideshow. Welcome, and I wasn't sure what to do with the PDFs. Yeah.
Let's just open the forms packet in case you need to look at one of the forms. Perfect, open and ready. Perfect.
There you go.
So the screen, okay, so if I'm at the PowerPoint and I want to, like this, I don't have to like change the screen, anything, I just pull it up like normal.
Right, so.
Thing, and let's click on that. And
Yeah.
you can see that.
Yep, and then just go right back to it.
That's perfect.
All righty. Now I'm showing you.
Check. A small group this morning. So I'm just gonna go over the changes in the contract. I know we've done the CE class, we kind of have gone in depth for the contracts overall, but I do just want to go through the changes to kind of recap that. So let me get the screen shared.
Really just do all this.
I think so. So if y'all have, well, I think there's someone else. Right. So if y'all have questions or thoughts, holler at me. We can make it helpful for you guys. So of course, y'all know me, I'm Ashley with O'Kelly and Sorengan. As always, I've got my cell phone up there. If y'all have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. So jumping right in to the actual per month, I think. Okay. There. So the GAR brochures, just a couple of small changes there on form CB 22, protect yourself when buying a home to be constructed. They just added, literally just added a note that says, see also CB 13, protect yourself when buying real property. So they, I guess they don't want people to think just because you're buying new construction, you don't need to know all of the other things that everyone else needs to know when they're buying a pre-loved home, if you will. So that's literally all they added on that. So certainly direct your buyers for new construction to be reviewing both of those forms. And then for the EPA, they've just updated it to add a link to the website so that y'all can include that in emails to other agents and to your clients, so they can understand the importance of lead-based paint and those guidelines. So nothing earth-shattering there. All right, so as far as the contract goes, there really were not a lot of like earth-shattering changes on the contract. I think it jumped. Okay, so nothing wild. One change that did happen was the closing costs. And so what they clarified is that the seller does have to pay a payoff in proceeds handling and delivery fee. So that's number 3. And then the buyer has to pay Number 4, all other title fees and post-closing fees. So what was happening was sellers were saying, a lot of attorneys have post-closing fees on the seller side. Sellers were saying, well, I said I was gonna pay $0 in closing costs, so I shouldn't have to pay this $75. And so you're gonna see a lot of attorneys change that $75 post-closing fee to be a $75 payoff and proceeds handling and delivering fee to match what the contract now said. So that just eliminates the seller argument at the table. I said I wasn't paying any closing costs, is really kind of the point of that. So y'all can see what that looks like. Now they just added number 3 for the sellers, and then of course number 4 for the buyers. So make it a little bit more user-friendly at the table. As far as the purchase and sale paragraph 4, the closing date and possession, nothing wild there. If you look at the actual first page of the contract, they just added that possession is either gonna be upon closing, and it's AM or PM. So they added the or, super, super important there. And then upon closing instead of at closing. I think the reason they added that was because, sometimes we close in escrow, like maybe we're waiting on the lender's money to come through. And so buyers were saying, okay, I went to closing, and since possession occurs at closing, I get the keys now, regardless of whether the closing is done. They put upon closing, I think, to sort of drive home the point that you don't get the keys, so you own it, is really what they're going for. That's always been true. They've just tried to make it a little bit easier as far as laying it out in the contract. There was also some confusion about the unilateral extension, so they added a clarifying sentence there. So it lists out the reasons that someone can use a unilateral extension. Really, there's only 3 reasons it can be used. 1, seller is not able to correct a title defect, not that they don't want to pay for it, that they're not able to correct it. 2, that the mortgage lender or closing attorney is not ready. Or 3, the closing disclosure hasn't gone out, so by law, buyer can't close. So what was happening on number 2 is sellers were saying, hey, your financing contingency has expired, so you can't use number 2 to extend it. It's not contingent on the loan anymore. You're not allowed to use unilateral. Sellers were wrong in saying that, but there was no clear spot to point to them and say, no, that's not how it works. Read this line. Now it's very clear. So they got it, including in transactions where the financing contingency has expired. So even if the contingency is expired, if the lender's not ready, you can still extend it. Now you can't terminate it and get your earnest money, but you can still extend it. So just a small point of clarification there. For the closing law firm, what we've updated is who we represent and adding a little bit of language there. So y'all know if there's a lender involved, we represent the lender. We don't represent the buyer or the seller. But if there is no lender and it's a cash transaction, there's historically been a lot of turmoil over who we actually represent. And so the contracts have always said that we represent the cash buyer, but a lot of attorneys had the stance, we represent the transaction. Well, the Georgia bars come out and said, you cannot just represent a transaction, you have to represent a party. So they've laid out what the requirements are. Really, we just matched that opinion with this language. So again, it's always been that we've represented the buyer. Now it just says what that limited representation is, because it's not really like, people coming from New York had a buyer attorney and a seller attorney, and they would review that information. That's not how it is here, and that's still not what we're doing for a cash buyer. We're not negotiating for them. We're not trying to get them the best deal. We literally are just doing these things as settlement agent, recording things, making sure things get signed, sending money to the right spot. So they really just beefed up that language. I don't think that's gonna change how y'all do business at all. So not a huge thing. That's really just to convince the attorneys to represent them. Sorry about that. So you can see what that language looks like. It used to just say including transactions where the method of payment referenced herein is all cash. Instead of that one little sentence, now we have this lovely long paragraph defining exactly what our representation is. So the inspection and due diligence section, they kind of did a big overhaul on this whole section. And it's not that they really changed much in it, they just made it a little bit more user friendly. It used to be this one huge paragraph that was really not fun to look through and read. Really what they've done is they've split it up into a bunch of smaller sections so that it's a lot more user friendly. And so they did end up bolding the section regarding meth labs. Obviously, we know that we have to disclose that. I think we also know that anyone with a meth lab is not going to disclose that, so, there's that, but it's important, meth is dangerous, they're just highlighting that, to make that super clear. They did change a couple of the headers, they used to say, like, buyer's duty to inspect the neighborhood, buyer's duty to inspect the property. The buyer really doesn't have a duty to inspect either of those things. They have the right to inspect it, but a duty implies you have to do something. And if a buyer doesn't want to inspect anything at all and they just want to buy it, that's fine. We don't want to obligate them to inspect something, but they do have the right to do that. So again, I don't think that's going to change the way you operate and do business at all. But they just clarified that. Again, made it a little bit more user friendly, splitting up those paragraphs. Something helpful in this section that I think y'all will use a lot. Again, it's not a change, but while we're talking about it, I like to touch on it. So I think you get a lot of clients, sellers in particular, that'll say, we want our contract to say as is. We're not going to make any changes. We want that language in there. It doesn't necessarily hurt anything, but it doesn't actually make a difference at all. Really, the contract is set up, if there's a due diligence period, the buyer can ask for whatever they want to ask for. There's nothing that says the buyer can't ask for it. But as soon as due diligence is over, the contract already says that it's an as-is contract. So I think it makes you guys look really good when your seller says, hey, I want it to say as is. Instead of saying, okay, and writing it in and say, the contract already said that. Let me explain what due diligence is to you, and let me show you where the contract says. As soon as that period's over, it's as is. And they might say, oh, that's awesome. And even if they still want you to write it, I think it still makes you look really knowledgeable that you can find that section in the contract and point them to it. So note that that's how that is actually set up. They did add a section on lead-based paint. So it was in a separate section of the contract, they just broke it out in that same vein of making it multiple paragraphs. Again, it doesn't change the way you operate, just kind of how everything looks. So this is what that looks like now, which again is a lot more user friendly than the way it used to look. One thing that they did add in this last one in part I, repairs, and it's kind of hard to see with the screen sharing button, but what that sentence says and what they added is unless otherwise agreed to in writing by the buyer and seller. So kind of the default is that repairs should be performed in a good and workmanlike manner prior to closing. But if both parties have agreed that it can be done in another manner, then it doesn't have to be done in that manner. And you might be thinking,
A question.
why did anyone agree to that? Yeah, Joe.
Question, so where is the phrase so we can point out that says as is?
So
You're-
that,
What paragraph?
so if you look, part F, due diligence period, if you look at part F, C, if buyer has not terminated this agreement,
thank
the buyer shall accept the property in as is condition, subject, blah, blah, blah. So
All right,
it's C8FC.
know where to look for it. Thank you. Very good.
You're so welcome.
By the way, your microphone is cutting out every now and then, but still we get the meat of it, just so you know.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Well,
it's kind of like, a bad sound, but it's not too bad. It's just cutting out. I don't know why, but we're going fine. Keep moving. We like it.
Okay, well, if it changes and you can't hear me, stop me and let me know so I can seek help, because I'm not quite clever enough to know what to do to fix it. But where I was going with the workmanlike manner, sometimes what happens is a lender might require something to be done in order to proceed with the loan, something like a bare minimum fix, but really what the buyer wants to do is some sort of larger repair. So maybe there's a deck that's got a few like rotten boards on it. And the lender says those boards need to be replaced. Well, the buyer knows that they're gonna tear down that whole deck and build this awesome patio out there. That would be an example of something that maybe they don't really care if it's done well, they just wanna be able to get the loan so they can move forward with it. It's kind of I would think a somewhat rare exception, but apparently it's common enough to where they wanted it in the actual contract. With the brokerage relationships, again, this is just a clarity thing. Almost all the changes, not all of them, but almost all of them have really just been an effort to clarify things and make y'all's job as far as explaining things easier to the clients. So in this no agency relationship section, it's saying that the buyer and seller are acknowledging that if they're not represented by a broker in a client relationship, they're responsible for protecting themselves. And then what they added is part B. If the same brokerage firm is representing one party as a client and working with the other party as a customer, the broker and all of broker's affiliated licensees are representing the client. So that's just clarifying, because I guess there were a lot of people that were confused, you know, when you're working with someone when you're representing someone as a client and working with the other side as a customer. This is just making it abundantly clear that your allegiance is with your client. And you might help them as a customer. When it comes down to it, you're representing the client. So this way, this is clear, it's in the contract, easy for y'all to point to, gets everyone on the same page. Again, nothing different than what you already know, just a point of clarity. I really like this change that they've added. So they've added a section, this is in part C, the FERPTA affidavit. So I think y'all have heard me talk about the foreign tax withholding or the federal tax withholding for someone who is not a US citizen, not a permanent resident, and not deemed a resident for tax purposes. So there's a test for that. Basically, if someone's a citizen, you don't have to worry about this. If they have a green card, you don't have to worry about this. If they spend enough time in the United States over the course of the last several years, which is a very specific test. So I would generalize it talking to your clients, you would just say, there's a test. If you pass this test, you don't have to pay that withholding. But what it is that the federal government wants to make sure that they get their actual tax allotment from the sale. And if someone has no obligation to actually pay federal taxes, the government has no idea whether or not they'll be able to get it. And so they have us withhold that amount, and it's actually a pretty substantial amount. It's 15% of the sales price. So not of the gain, they don't care what the gain is, it's of the sales price. So that's a huge amount, right? You know, on a $100,000 house, it's 15,000. On $1 million house, it's 150,000. It's a pretty big chunk of change. And so what was happening, I think, is sellers were learning this either at the closing table or once they were under contract, well under contract, and saying, what the heck, I didn't know about this withholding. Now, just like any other withholding, it does not speak to their actual tax liability. So if they file taxes, there's a good chance they'll get some or all of that back. The government just doesn't know if they'll file taxes in the first place. So they put this in the contract to go ahead and kind of put it on everyone's radar, make sure that somewhere someone has told them, you might have to have this huge withholding. And it opens up the conversation for them to say, what is this? What is that withholding like? And then it's not a last minute thing, just in an effort to prevent what's not a fun surprise at the very last minute. I think they've got this in your listing agreements as well, your seller brokerage agreements. So again, a good thing to bring up and say, hey, there is a federal tax withholding, and I don't know that y'all really want to get way too into the weeds on it, but you could just say there is a federal tax withholding that may be applicable if you're not a US citizen or don't have a green card. You know, we'll talk to the closing attorney about it, but just heads up, this could be applicable. Like a simple putting it on their radar situation. This is not a change, but since we're talking about the purchase and sale, I get so many questions and so many issues about this. Just a quick reminder of what the binding agreement date is. So it's the date that the party who's signing second, so the accepting party, delivers notice to the offering party, the party that signs first, that they've accepted the offer. Okay, so Cam, you're the buyer, you send me an offer, you've already signed it, I'm the seller, I sign it today, I send it to you tomorrow, what's our binding agreement date?
That's right. Or today, I guess.
Tomorrow.
When I get it back,
Not when you get it, when I send it.
when you said, oh, okay, but yeah.
So the different, I guess to clarify that, I sign it today, I send it to you tomorrow, you open the email on Saturday, tomorrow's our binding agreement day. I don't care if you open the email or not, it matters when I send it. But it's not today, because I didn't send it to you. So be careful with that. I always say, if you're the agent representing the accepting party, so if there's no counter offer and your seller is just signing the offer, the listing agent should go ahead and fill in that binding agreement date, because you know exactly when you're hitting send on that email. If not, especially if you're doing it in the evening, you hit send at 9 o'clock at night, you don't fill in the binding agreement date, the other agent opens it the following morning, they're probably gonna fill in that date, not the date that you sent it. So they've extended the due diligence period by a day, which is not good for your seller, right? So know that binding agreement date, and if it's counter offer, it's really typically, there's one counter offer gonna be the buyer, who's the second party, right? Because the seller has submitted the counter, buyer's either gonna accept it or not. So no, binding agreement is when the accepting party delivers notice that they've accepted. So they've signed it and sent it over. Okay, a lot of agents say, they signed the contract and then I got it back and I bound the contract. You did not bind the contract. You wrote in the binding date, which is helpful, but what you write on that line is not, it does not create any kind of legal value. So all it does is get everyone on the same page, provides clarity. It's important to have, but what binds the contract is when you hit send on the email. So, well, refresher, there are forms, so if you get a contract. Oh, are you saying something, Joe?
Yeah, I didn't know you were watching. So I'm still a little confused. You're saying if I'm the seller and I send over the contract, I should not put the binding date in until the buyer. Oh, yeah, as a seller, they would make me the offer and then I would put the binding date in and send it back. So if you're saying if I bind it on Tuesday, but it doesn't get, and I write in there Tuesday binding date and I send it back on Wednesday, it doesn't count. It's really Wednesday's the binding date?
Yeah, you shouldn't write in Tuesday if you're not gonna send it until Wednesday. So the reason I say that the agent representing the accepting party should fill that in is because they know when they're gonna hit send. So you're doing yourself, the other side, your client a disservice if they sign it on Tuesday and then you write the binding agreement date is Tuesday and you don't send it until Wednesday. You've already set yourself up to have an argument. Know that if you're filling in that binding agreement date, you should send it immediately because you're about to send it. That's why you're writing in that date. So
Right.
yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. And there's a form. If there's an argument about it, you want to bring that up because if binding agreement date really is Tuesday, but the agent, fills it out wrong, writes Wednesday on there, then everyone just moves forward and nobody says anything. A court could say, okay, sure, Tuesday should have been a binding agreement date. However, nobody said anything. You all acted like it was Wednesday, therefore it was Wednesday. So if someone fills it in wrong, say something, send over the amendment to fix it. Okay. So you've got that evidence that you did not agree on the binding agreement date. The survival section, there was a change there. So y'all know the contract is essentially set up to die upon closing. All obligations other than what's listed here go away. So if the seller is supposed to buy a buyer a home warranty at closing and it's not on the settlement statement, nobody says anything. 3 weeks later, you're like, hey, where's that home warranty? You've lost it, At closing, we have paperwork signed saying everyone agrees to correct any inadvertent errors. But at the end of the day, your contract says that it's died upon closing, unless it's one of these things that survive. So whenever y'all call me about an amendment to replace windows after closing, I'm always gonna tell you to write, this amendment shall survive closing, or else it doesn't mean anything as soon as you close. So there's 8 things that survive closing. So the obligation to pay commission, because remember, these forms are written primarily to protect you guys. So That's the first thing on the list, obligation to pay commission, which again is why if there's an issue with commission, you shouldn't necessarily hold up closing for it. Go ahead and get your partial commission because the obligation to pay whatever your commission should have been continues to exist. So like a partial commission or not getting a commission, just because you closed doesn't mean the obligation goes away.
But isn't that worked out prior to the closing? I mean,
Oh, it
you showed
should be.
yourself the statement, there's the number.
It should be, yes.
It's showing on the settlement statement, so.
Right, but sometimes what happens is, you know, maybe an agent and a seller had verbally agreed to something else, because we don't get the brokerage agreements. We don't need the brokerage agreements. All we get is instructions to close the trade. And if a seller or buyer calls and they're like, hey, that's not what I agreed to, we're like, well, what does your brokerage agreement say? You need to call your agent and talk to them about it. So sometimes arguments come up about it. Again, it shouldn't happen very often, but sometimes it does. But I just want it to be clear that you shouldn't necessarily hold up the sale for it because this obligation continues to exist.
Every agent out there is hold up.
I understand. No, I'm not saying like, don't, not what I'm saying. But also this is important too, because like, what if you have a brokerage agreement, like a buyer brokerage agreement, and you clearly brought them to this property, you clearly are owed commission, your engagement agreement says that they owe you that 3% of the seller doesn't pay it, but they go behind your back, they close and they move on. Obligation didn't die with the closing, they still owe you commission, is the more common use of that, but either way, it's good for you guys. Any warranty of title survives closing. Any written representation of the seller regarding the neighborhood where the property is located, or if the property itself, buyer's indemnification obligations arising out of the inspection of the property by buyer and buyer's representatives. So number 4 is what they've added. So if something happens and they still have some sort of responsibility due to something that occurred in the inspection, that doesn't just go away with closing. That continues to exist. The section on condemnation continues to exist. We want to protect us, so we got the attorney's fees, that continues to exist. Obligation of parties regarding taxes, so you know, when the tax bill comes out, because right now, all of our closings, we don't have the tax bill out, so we're using last year's bill. And so when the tax bill comes out in the fall, it's a lot higher. Really what the contract says is we're prorating based off the current year. And so this is saying, if there's any adjustments, everyone agrees to do that, that continues to survive closing. And then the last one is any obligation which the parties herein agree shall survive the closing or may be performed or fulfilled after the closing. So that's why we're writing, this shall survive closing on our amendment. So it's kind of a catch-all. If you say it survives, but you gotta say it survives. One more change on this, and it's not on the slide because it's kind of silly, but they added a definition of the initials NA. Apparently that was difficult, and so that has been added. Questions on the purchase and sale?
That had to be something with the initials NA, that got in trouble for that. You initially.
Maybe, I don't know. That's an interesting thought. Real quick, the land purchase and sale agreement, same universal changes that we just went over, because most of those paragraphs are very similar. So those changes have all continued on through the land purchase and sale. Quick reminder, as far as land goes, there's the CUBA exemption, it addresses that. So there's a tax break for using agricultural land and keeping it in its natural state. It's a covenant with the county or with the city, and it's a pretty long covenant, and there's significant tax implications if you breach that covenant. And so the way the contract is set up is to say, if the sale breaches the covenant, or if the buyer, the fact that the buyer is buying it, the buyer's use of the land, if any of that breaches the covenant, it's the seller's responsibility to pay that. And I think because really the seller's the only one who knows whether they have the covenant or not. Right, so they put the obligation on the seller because they're the only one who knows. Now, if a buyer says that whatever their use is going to be of the land is going to conform to that covenant and it shouldn't breach the covenant, then it becomes the buyer's responsibility. So the big takeaway on these land contracts, if that's relevant, and 99.9% of sellers are going to know darn well whether they have that covenant or not. So talk to your seller but make sure you're either selling to a buyer that is gonna use the land for the same purpose, and you put that in the contract. Or you simply have the buyer confirm that they will continue to use the land. Just make sure if you represent a seller who has this, that that language is in the contract, so if there is a breach of the covenant, the buyer has to pay it. If you don't address it, seller's paying it. So temporary occupancy, we do have a good amount of changes on this form. It's always been the case that the seller had to give the buyer a set of keys to the property, because the buyer, of course, is now the owner, even though they're not gonna actually move in yet. But a lot of homes don't even have a physical key anymore. It's just like a touchpad. So they've added are door openers, codes, and other similar equipment needed to access the property. So basically now, a seller has to give a buyer a way to access the property, not simply just a key. And then in paragraph 8, this one, the reason this came up, and essentially what it's doing is saying that the seller has to continue to maintain the property and let the buyer know of any issues that come up. Because really all the seller has to fix is anything that they create, any issue they create, not anything that's normal wear and tear. So what was happening was you have a seller, it rains, there's a bad storm, there's a huge leak in the roof. It's not the seller's fault, but they would say, I'm moving out in a week, I'm just gonna let it sit. And so instead of being a small leak, now it's a huge issue. So this puts the obligation on the seller, like, let's be good people and tell the owner of the property when something has gone wrong. They added a new paragraph, so paragraph 9. So if buyer's giving seller a 24-hour notice, buyer can access the property to repair and maintain it. And they can enter if there's a potential emergency. So if they think that something terrible is going on, they can go on and enter the property. Make sure that you're not letting your clients be a jerk with this. Give them that notice. But I think some sellers were saying, hey, sure, you own it, but I'm occupying it and you're just not allowed to come in at all. This is preventing that. An owner of a property should always be able to access the property that they own. And then in paragraph 11, it goes, and it used to be paragraph 10, I think, but they moved it to 11. This is just clarifying what exactly holdover rent is. And so what holdover rent is, this is not how much the seller is paying per day to occupy the property after closing. This is after that temporary occupancy period has come and gone and the seller's not allowed to be there anymore. What is that daily fee or daily penalty for staying after you're allowed to be there? And so they used to just call it holdover rent, which is still what they call it. But now they kind of clarified what that amount should really cover. And so a lot of times I would see $100 or $150 in here. But when you really think about it, is that enough to cover the buyer's mortgage, the buyer's rent, because now they can't move in? Is that enough to cover the penalty because they're not moving out of their place that they're renting? Is that enough to cover the storage unit? Is that enough to cover, any court costs to get them to actually evict this seller now? Does it cover all of that? And honestly, $100, if I'm a seller, it's cheaper for me to stay in my own house and give you $100 than to go down and stay at a hotel for $200 or $300. So really think through what costs need to be covered in that amount, like on a daily basis, and then make it hurt for the seller. Make it something that they don't want to pay. The likelihood of getting that may be kind of low, right? But if it's enough money, like if you put $500, or if it's, a more expensive house, you put $1,000 a day. You can't make it ludicrous, like $25,000 a day, unless it's a really expensive house. Then a court could say that's just silly. You have to justify it to some degree. But if you've got $1,000 a day and they stay in there 10 extra days, you might sue them over 10 grand. You're not going to sue them over 1,000, but you might sue them over 10,000. So just make sure it's enough to make it actually hurt for the seller. And then they've added a new paragraph. The very last one, just advising everyone to consult with their insurance agent, because the seller still needs to have like the equivalent of renter's insurance to insure their stuff. Buyer should have homeowner's insurance the second they own it. So it's just a little bit of clarity. Make sure that you do in fact talk to an insurance agent, see what's needed. Option agreement. Do y'all ever use this? Does anyone ever use this? I can't imagine why, especially with the market as it is right now, that this would get used very much. But basically what this is saying, I want the option to buy the property. So it may be my neighbor's house, like if you ever move, I wanna buy it. So you would fill out this agreement, and then you would also fill out a purchase and sale agreement. And so you wanna put, there's a paragraph in there that basically says, the attached contract is deemed to have the following special stipulation. Go ahead and add that stipulation to your contract. It's just a catch-all if you don't add it. But if y'all don't ever use it, I don't know that going through the changes is gonna be a good use of y'all's time. But essentially, if you have someone who is like, if my neighbor ever moves, I wanna buy it, and I wanna go ahead and put that in the contract, that the option to buy it, you would use this form, and then you would use a purchase and sale. Same idea, so option to purchase leased property. Same thing, option to purchase. So your brokerage agreements, this is what establishes the relationship you have either with your client or with someone who owns a property that you want to show that you're not representing. So the point of them is to protect the brokers, the sellers, the buyers, really the consumers and the agents is who we're aiming to protect here and setting up standards so that nobody gets confused on things. So we're establishing those duties. Importantly, we're establishing the commissions. It's defining the scope of marketing. Remember, you're not really authorized to list a property and market it until you have an engagement agreement with the seller. So just be careful about that. And it defines the types of agencies. So real quick, dual agency is if you yourself are representing the buyer as a client and you're representing the seller as a client. Chadwick does allow for it, but you have to get specific broker approval. I don't like that. I don't think it's physically possible to truly represent a buyer and a seller at the same time, because at a very base level, buyer wants to pay as little as possible, seller wants to get paid as much as possible. Those are inverse, so I don't know how you represent both well. But again, the brokerage allows it, but you gotta get broker approval for that. Now, if you've got two agents in the same brokerage, like maybe Joe's representing the buyer and Jaime's representing the seller, that's fine. That's dual agent, or not dual agency, designated agency. So that's fine. That's not dual agency. So just be careful on that. So what we've added to the seller brokerage agreement, again, not anything earth shattering. But we've added in the images section that broker is not liable to seller if other brokers or buyers take photographs, videos, or capture images, more or less, or manipulate images. So you shouldn't really encourage that, but you want to tell your sellers, hey, take down all your personal stuff. If other people take pictures, there's nothing really I can do about it. So they've just added that language in there to protect you guys. And then they've also added the language that a seller's broker does not have the obligation to pay a cooperating broker who's not a participant on that particular MLS. So that's not a rule that GAR is creating. That's a rule that the MLS has. GAR has just added their rule into the GAR contracts to provide clarity. So if you're showing a property and if you've got a buyer showing the property and you are not part of the listing service that it's listed on, just go ahead and get the instructions the closing attorney signed before you show it. That fixes it. So just pay attention to that, know that that's the rule.
What's the point of that? If I'm licensed in Georgia.
I
I'm gonna sell it here.
I am not in charge of the MLS rules.
Just kind of curious, I'm like, what makes up, if I go down to Savannah and my neighbor wants a place in Savannah, I go on Zillow, I find it, because I'm not part of their MLS, but I go down there, set it up and show it to them. They don't pay me a commission because I'm not part of Savannah's MLS.
Correct. So that's why if you're gonna do, and you can do that, there's no commission rule or law that says that you can't do that. It's just all about the commission. So I don't know why MLS has that rule. I just know that they do. And I think the reason GAR's added it in really is to be helpful and bring that knowledge to you guys. Because I think that surprises a lot of people, because every time I talk about it, I get questions on it. And so if you're showing a property, see if, like, what listing service it's on. If you are not part of that listing, multiple listing service, get the instructions of closing attorney signed before you show it. It's really the only way to ensure that. Now.
In some
listing
ways,
agent-
actually, some ways they can't show it because, like, if you go up to North Georgia and you don't belong to that board, your key will not work in their lockbox. So the different boards have different lock boxes. So you can't just go show it. You got to have permission and some way of getting in it.
Okay, well, logistically, yeah, I don't know the ins and outs of that, but you definitely want to make sure you can show up before you drive to Savannah, but also get the instructions to closing attorney signed, so you know you can get paid for it as well.
So
they also, yeah, Joe.
is there a way to get a temporary right to show it and be able to get a commission, or do you actually have to join that MLS?
No, you don't have to join the MLS. You have to have an agreement with the listing agent that they're gonna pay you. Like, you would use that form and send it there and let them know that you're expecting to get paid. I was just saying that we've had people go to show a property thinking it had a lockbox, which it does, but then their key won't work because it's not our board. So it's kind of confusing, but
Okay, so
Yeah, I
can,
think the logistics of being able to show it is a different question than the requirement to get a commission or the obligation for the other agent to pay you a commission. So I'm just talking about the very narrow, are you gonna get a commission or not? Getting the listing agent to sign the instructions to closing attorney before you show it is gonna fix that very narrow question. As far as being able to show it, that's gonna be something that you work out with that other agent. And so I don't think it's the case that you're not permitted to show it. I think what Ruth is saying is, like, logistically, you're not physically gonna be able to get it. So it's not like a rule that's being broken. It's that you need to make sure logistically you can get into the property or you physically can't show it.
so you just need the instructions to attorneys to be signed before, that's all you need to qualify for the commission.
Right, because they're agreeing to pay you that commission. They've also added that very important definition of NA into the seller brokerage agreement. And the buyer brokerage agreement as well. Questions or thoughts on the small changes for the brokerage agreements? Nothing really crazy, but. Okay. So for the conventional loan contingency exhibit, there were some, I guess, structural changes, if you will. Not a whole lot of changes that are gonna affect how you operate, other than logistically where you're literally filling things in. So it used to be that the financing contingency and the appraisal contingency paragraphs were kind of buried within the contract. Well, sort of fitting in with the theme that they've tried to do recently over the last few changes and making them more user friendly, putting in all the fill in the blanks in section A and then having B be all the explanatory paragraphs. They've really just moved and added 2 extra paragraphs to that first page. So the length of the financing contingency period is now paragraph 3, and then length of the appraisal contingency period is paragraph 4. And then the actual explanation of those 2 are later on, so those are paragraph 7 and 13, but just literally filling in how long those periods are. We're moved to page 1. With the financing contingency, they did add some language that the financing contingency ending does not cut short an appraisal contingency. So those are 2 separate contingencies. You don't have to finish the appraisal contingency within the loan contingency. I think there were issues where people, especially over the last couple of years, were putting 0 days or 1 day for financing, and then maybe, 10 days for appraisal or 8 days for appraisal. And the appraisal was coming in low, and sellers were saying, you don't have a financing contingency at all. I don't care what your appraisal says. This is clarifying that's not how that works. They're 2 separate contingencies. So that's really all they've updated on that one. As far as the FHA, I think this is the single biggest change of all of the changes. So this is the most important one to me. Not as important, they moved, same thing as conventional, they put the length of the financing contingency period on page 1. So you're filling in that number on page 1. There is no length of the appraisal contingency period, because we know the amendatory clause runs the full length of the contract. So they did add clarity language that buyer's right under the amendatory clause exists even after the contingency period expires. That seems to be in line with what they've done with the conventional loan. But what the big change is to me is they did change how the amendatory clause works for FHA. So it used to be that amendatory clause ran the full length of the contract. And at any point in time before closing, if that appraisal came in low, buyer could terminate the contract. They didn't have any obligation to talk to the seller about it. It could come in $1 low, and it could come in, 25 days before closing. It could come in $1 low, and on the morning of closing, the buyer could still terminate because of the low appraisal. So that's how it was set up. And I think it was set up like that to protect the FHA buyer. Well, I think a lot of the FHA buyers were starting to abuse that. And so what would happen, and they'll think, well, why would anyone terminate if it's $1 low? Who cares? And they don't. And especially if you go 25 days, it ends up that it's not really the appraisal that they're actually worried about. So they wanted seller to paint, the laundry room. Seller wouldn't do it. All of a sudden they get into a fight. It's not a nice transaction anymore. Buyer says, I'll walk away. Appraisal contingency, a mandatory clause fails. I get the earnest money back. And it worked. So they've changed it. Now it works more like the VA, a mandatory clause. And the way that works is the buyer now does have to submit their amendment to change sales price and have to give the seller the opportunity to reduce the sales price. If the seller reduces it, they have to buy it. And the language where I'm getting that is kind of farther down the amendatory clause paragraph. What it says is if the written statement by the Federal Housing Commissioner or direct endorsement lender sets forth an appraised value of the property that is less than the minimum appraised value set forth in this amendatory clause, seller may reduce the purchase price to an amount equal to such actual appraised value, and the parties shall close at such lower purchase price with appropriate adjustments to the sales agreement. So the fact that it says parties shall close means parties have to close. So your buyer can no longer use that at the last second to get out of the contract. That's a big change in the way y'all operate. So don't use the old version of the amendatory clause. That's not how it works anymore. Understand that kind of get out of jail free card that you used to have, not the case anymore. So it works like VA, still runs the entire length of the contract. And so, a buyer doesn't ever have to reduce the sales price. Like if it's 100,000 or if it's 1,000 low and buyer's like, I'm not even gonna fool with it, that's fine. They can totally close at a higher sales price. They can't just like terminate and walk away anymore, is the difference there. And only other small change is in the repairs section. So at the top of the 3rd page of that exhibit, it talks about FHA required repairs. And so you fill in an amount that can be paid for, and it says who's paying for that. And typically you fill in seller, and typically we see something like $500 to $1,500, something in that range. But if those FHA required repairs exceed whatever amount you filled in on that blank, then the buyer has to provide the seller with a breakdown of that cost, and parties go back and forth and negotiate who's actually going to pay for that. And if no agreement is met, then the contract automatically terminates. What they've added here is that it shall automatically terminate without penalty to the buyer. So it always automatically terminated. They just clarified if it does automatically terminate, buyer's getting their earnest money. So that's just a clarity thing. For the VA, over the summer, the actual VA changed their requirements. And so the contract has just been updated to reflect that. Again, they have the same change that conventional and FHA had with moving the financing contingency period length being its own paragraph on the 1st page. But substance wise, who's paying for the termite letter is a little bit bigger change. So it used to be that the seller had to pay for it. Because VA loans, a termite letter is required, a clear termite letter. You can't get around that. Used to say seller had to pay for it. Now we're checking the box. So first thing, be careful that you actually check this box. Super important, don't skip over that. But now the VA allows the buyer or the seller to pay for it. So check who's paying for it, represent the buyer, check the seller. If you want to fight it from the seller side, you could, counter back and say buyer, but termite letters aren't all that expensive. So I don't know that it's worth any level of heartburn as who's gonna pay for it. You just gotta know whose responsibility is it to go get it, right? If it says buyer, then the buyer needs to set it up and make sure it happens, or their loan's not gonna close. But what the seller does have to pay for is if buyer pays for that initial letter, they go out, they find termites, then they have to fix the termites and get a new letter. Seller does have to pay for that new letter. So the checkbox is only for the initial termite letter. If no issues, great. If there's issues, then the seller's paying to fix it and get the new letter. Probably the second biggest change in all the forms is with the no financing contingency. We used to call it an all cash sale exhibit. Now it's not all cash, now it's called no financing contingency. And the reason we did that, or the reason GAR did that, is because a lot of people were doing the bait and switch. So they would say, okay, I'm gonna pay for it all cash, but I'm gonna reserve the right to get a loan, knowing darn well they were gonna get a loan the entire time. And people were even doing that when they didn't actually have the proof of funds. And so technically with the old form, the way it was set up, is that the buyer had to be able to buy in cash. They might reserve the right to get a loan, but they had to prove that they had the money in the bank to buy it. And people weren't doing that. They were using the form wrong. It was creating a lot of animosity and a lot of mess. So they've updated it. And I think I've got the two. So you can see what the old section used to look like. So they either have the right and they reserve to get an institutional or a non-institutional, or they are not allowed to get one. Now what they've done, instead of saying fooling with the bait and switch, you're either checking, I'm buying it all cash, or I'm getting a loan, there's just no loan contingency. So kind of a little bit more clear here, I think. It does address when the 8-day unilateral can be used. So obviously if you're buying it all cash, you can't use a mortgage lender delay as an 8-day extension, because there should be no lender there. But also with the no financing contingency, notice that it says the buyer has no right to unilaterally extend the closing for 8 days for reason of mortgage delay. They shall have the right to extend the closing if the closing attorney is not ready, unless the attorney is not ready because the lender's not ready, right? Like if the lender has not sent me the package for your buyer to sign, you can't say that's an attorney delay. Because like you can come into my office, you can sign my papers, but it's not gonna do anybody any good because the lender's not ready. So that is a pretty substantial change. Be able to explain that and kind of in that same line, the verification of funds paragraph, I got that info on that. So it used to be set up that you could either get like account statements or letters from whoever's providing the account statement, or would provide the account statement from like a trust, stock brokerage firm, financial institution. All of those were acceptable verification of funds situations. But what they've added is a third option. So what it says is if option 1B is selected above, so if this is selected, so finance purchase with no financing contingency, then obviously you're not going to be able to provide proof of funds for a cash purchase, right? So they've added a third option that says if option 1B is selected above, a loan commitment letter from a mortgage lender. So that's the third option for verification of funds. So if you say I'm doing it all cash, you're still providing the traditional, you're still providing the traditional verification of funds. But if you selected, I'm getting a loan, but there's no contingency for my loan, then your verification of funds is a loan commitment letter from a mortgage lender. So just keeping the form intact. But those are really the only changes on that exhibit, but it is going to pretty significantly change how y'all utilize it. Questions on the no financing contingency exhibit?
I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around it, but if you are going to finance with no financing contingency, why wouldn't you just do it as a regular loan contingency with no financing date?
Form is set up to be a financing contingency. It's called the conventional loan contingency. Here, let me see.
All right, I'm saying, but if you use the no financing exhibit and you select B, you're really saying I'm going for a mortgage, but I'm not going to have any financing date contingency, right?
Right. So it's really kind of the same thing as filling in 0.
Or if you get a hard money lender.
Yeah, if you get a hard money lender, you would also do that. So why would you want to use that form, the other form? What do you think that gives you that this one doesn't?
Well, I'm just not sure I understand enough, being, kind of slow of mind here.
You're not, no, you're not slow on it. So the conventional loan contingency exhibit, that's set up to say, this contract is contingent upon the buyer getting this loan. Here's all of the terms that the loan denial letter is gonna have to meet for the buyer to be able to use that loan denial letter to get out of the contract and get their earnest money back within this time window. So if you say none of that applies, all that's relevant on that form is the appraisal contingency. And the no financing contingency does have an appraisal section. So you can still have an appraisal contingency on this no financing contingency form.
All right, so again, forgive me for maybe not understanding, but if I'm using a conventional loan and I put the financing contingency date as 0 days, it's the same as this form, right?
Essentially, but why would you use a form that says this loan is, or this contract is contingent upon this loan, except for it's not contingent upon this loan? You would just not use that sentence. So you're doing extra work, and the value in this is that this form is a lot more attractive to a seller. If you give a conventional loan contingency form and you put 0 days for the financing contingency, you're making that listing agent and that seller work to figure out that you're trying to give them something. You're giving up a loan contingency. Why would you make them work when you can give them this form that looks better for your buyer and tells them immediately that there's no financing contingency? So like it's not that you can't do it in the conventional form, you can, it's just why would you? This form is more efficient and it looks a lot better for your buyer. Because the only thing that is on there that would remain intact is the appraisal contingency, which again, you can add on this form. So there's no reason to do it that way.
All right, so they're just cutting out the ability to throw in a mortgage at the last minute. All right. All right.
No, it's not, I mean, yes, the bait and switch, but those were never really last minute things. But it's not the ability, really, this form was designed to say, hey, what is your plan from the outset? And you can always amend a contract, right? It's just getting everyone on the same page from the beginning.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Seller's property disclosure. The only thing they've added really on this form is with the fixtures checklist. They've added a sentence right above the actual checklist that says, once the seller's property is under contract, the items that may be removed and taken by the seller as reflected in this seller's property disclosure statement may only be amended with the written consent of the buyer of the property. This section titled Fixtures Checklist shall survive closing. And so what was happening was we all know that whenever there's a change, it's the seller's responsibility to go update the seller's disclosure. That's always been true. But what was happening is sellers were saying, oh, there's an update. I actually want to take that fridge now. I'm simply going to update the disclosure to reflect that I'm taking the fridge. Buyers went under contract, understanding that they were going to keep the fridge. So the seller can't unilaterally decide they're going to take the fridge now. You have to amend it. That's always really been the case. This has put that very clear. So when the seller tries to do it, you can say, no, your contract says you cannot do that. Here's that exact sentence. So it just adds clarity. Doesn't change the way you operate it. Just trying to kind of cut off an issue that was happening.
So it takes
As
a
far as-
normal amendment for that to address the property disclosure, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so if the seller says, oops, I didn't mean to say that the fridge was staying, and the buyer's like, I don't care a thing about the fridge, just do an amendment to say, seller is taking fridge and garage, or whatever it is that they want to do. That's perfectly fine. Absolutely. For the condo disclosure, we know that the Florida condo collapse has created a lot of changes, in how we operate as far as condos go, but they just added a couple of questions to try to get the ball rolling on answering those items for the lender. So now in the seller's property disclosure for a condo, they've added what year was the building which the unit is located originally built, what year was the declaration of condominium first recorded, and then is the condominium a condominium conversion? If yes, what year is it converted? Because I think what was happening is people were saying, okay, sure, it's been a condo since 2015, but really the building was built in 1965. They didn't convert it to a condo until 2015. So just trying to get a little bit more information to see how the condo is doing. The lead-based paint disclosure, real quick, was just updated to match EPA guidelines. Remember, you need to have this signed at your listing, because this has to be signed by all parties before the contract is binding. So you can't fix it after the fact, and the fines for this are significant. So you're gonna pay a lot of money if the EPA catches you doing it wrong. So baseline, if this disclosure is relevant for the house you're listing, get it signed with your listing agreement. End of story. There should never be an exception to that, because if it's signed with the listing agreement, then as the buyer and the buyer's agent, when you go pull all the paperwork for that listing, that is gonna be there. You can have that signed. You're gonna sign it, send it with the offer. Seller and buyer have signed it, you're good to go. And then you send over the offer, so the sign first. Always do it in the listing.
I have one right now that I'm about to be under contract with, that is relevant. They don't have it yet, but they're getting it. And they've already used the house bill on the market for a while, so they're in breach right now.
No. The rule is that it has to be done before there's a binding contract. So like if you do it today, you go under contract tomorrow, it's fine.
Okay.
But if the buyer sends you an offer and your seller has not signed it and your seller signs the offer, now you have a contract, now you have a problem.
Without that, okay.
Correct,
Okay.
correct. So I say best practice is to do it at your listing, so you never run into it.
Quick clarification on the condo, going back, if I'm selling just a townhouse here, is that still considered a condo?
No, a townhouse is different than a condo. It's all about what's owned. It's not about how it looks. It's about how it's reported and what is owned. And so in a townhome, you own the walls. You own the small patch of land that it sits on. With a condo, all you own is what's inside the walls. You don't own the exterior walls. You don't own the ground that the building sits on. So some condos look like what we consider a townhome. So it's all about how the property is deeded. So what do you do to figure that out?
Well, I guess you find it on the property tax records disclosure if it's a condo then instead of a townhouse, right?
No, it might have that information, but I wouldn't trust it. Where's pretty much definitive? Where do you know to get the real answer?
Ashley at O'Kelly, I'm sorry.
So the deed is the answer, but Cam's right. Email me the address and the county the property's in, I'll pull the deed and I can tell you. If the deed has language about a declaration of condominium, it's a condo. If it does not have that language, it is not a condo. So that's like the definitive way to look and see whether it's a condo. Pull the deed. But I'm happy to do that. And we'll quickly scoot through the last couple of changes because I know we're a little bit over. Y'all be happy to know that there's no big change in the CAD. All they've added is under the type of association, they've added voluntary transitioning to mandatory, and then whether buyer is mandatory or voluntary member. Because sometimes, they're selling right in that transition period and they're like, well, I don't know which one's applicable to me. Now you can check the transitioning box and then you have to indicate whether the buyer is going to be voluntary or mandatory. So small change there, which you probably won't use very often, but in case you do. In the sale or lease of buyer's property contingency exhibit, I think there was an issue with buyers who are selling their other property going under contract for their other property at a much higher value than they thought possible, because everyone was getting way over what they were listing it for. And because they sold it at such a higher price, they were saying, oh, well, heck, I didn't know I was gonna get that much money for my house. I'm not gonna go under contract. I'm gonna list it at this higher amount. And now I don't want your $500,000 house anymore. I can afford a $600,000 house. So they were terminating their contract for their purchase. So what they've done in one of the sections where it's called buyer closing on the sale of the other property, so their sale property, it says that it should not be listed at more than X dollars, because big picture wise, if you're trying to sell your house that's worth 600,000, you could effectively kill your buy deal by listing it at $1 million, because nobody's gonna buy your $600,000 house for $1 million. So to prevent that, they put a cap on it. Well, by putting a cap, when a person realizes how much they can get for their house, well, now if they put 600, they realize they can get 700, they're gonna list it as 7. Now all of a sudden, they're not in compliance with this document. They can very easily terminate their buy contract. So they've added, it's nothing here, and shall give the buyer an ability to terminate the agreement if the property sells for an amount greater than the list price. So they're trying to combat that. Which again, was always really true, like there is a requirement in this document to have good faith in trying to sell the property, and that obviously would not be good faith, but that has been added, so it does not occur, and it's a very easy place to point and say this should not have it. Backup contingency exhibit, a lot of changes on this form, really the point of it and kind of the consistent, multiple changes all in the same sort of goal. And the goal is to list out what position you're in. Because we used to just see one backup offer and that was it. Then from 2020 through now, what we see is you might be backup first, second, third, fourth position. So they just added language to say what position are you in. Is really all they've done there, and then instead of saying the backup agreement, it's backup agreements and other agreements in higher positions, like that kind of thing, to just make it relevant that there could be a hierarchy of positions is really the big change there. Super, super small. Oh, and then of course with that, they added an entire new form that lists out the hierarchy for the backup. So that's form 605. So you've got the backup form that you put with your contract, say this is a backup contract, but then you also have the addendum to the backup agreement contingency that lists out who's in what position. For the amendment to change closing date, the possession instead of through, it's now conveyed to buyer. So buyer agrees to allow seller to retain possession of the property through, now it's property conveyed to buyer. So change that, I think is gonna affect your life exactly 0. New form is amendment to assign agreement. So an assignment is like, I'll go out and sign a contract as a buyer, but really I was just like a headhunter for my sister. So I want to assign all my rights as a buyer to my sister. The actual boilerplate language does not allow that. This amendment allows that. So now the seller and me and my sister can all sign off saying, I'm assigning the rights over to her. So that's,
So you just got a house under contract, and then your sister's gonna take over because she's.
yeah, and we don't really see this a lot with like
So that's-
sisters buying houses for each other. We do see this with investors a lot. So some investors' entire business model is I'm gonna go find the property, I'm gonna get it under contract, and I'm gonna sign it to someone else. So if like, you know, I'm the finder and we go under contract with Connor LLC, but really I know I'm gonna send it to Nance LLP, then Connor LLC and Nance LLP are gonna have an assignment agreement. And it's probably gonna say that Nance LLP is gonna give me $30,000 to take over my place as buyer in the contract between me and you. And so that'll go on the settlement statement as a cost for the buyer, and we can pay that assigned order that way. But it's, you see it mostly with investors. If it's a situation where like the wife goes under contract and then they really decide that the buyer is gonna be the husband, I would just amend that. You don't wanna do an assignment. Really, you're doing an assignment when there's money being involved for that, really like a finder's fee kind of thing. And then these nets, they've been adjusted, really the only changes for the buyer, net cost to buyer, they've added a line for commission. Since sometimes buyer pays commission, so y'all can use these to help kind of guess at what it costs or proceeds are gonna be. And then the only other changes are with leases, which we don't talk too much about, but there's a rate on display right now. I know we kind of blew through that fairly quickly, but there's always quite a lot to talk about with the changes. Y'all have questions about them at all?
I think we're good.
All right, good stuff. Well, I will stop the
Great.
share.
Yeah, I think some of these parts show a team meeting, just, not the whole thing, but points along the way. That'd be helpful.
Sure, any in particular that stand out, I'll make note for.
Yeah, there was one in particular. Now I forgot it. I'll go back and look and I'll tell you.
Okay. But yeah, certainly can do that, and then, the new ones will come out either in May or June. So, just around the corner, we'll get to do it all again.
So this one came out when? These
This
changes
was,
got,
this was the January ones. I had just gotten a couple of requests, because I think some people had missed the CE classes, so they just wanted a little summary of all of the changes. And
Yeah,
so I'd be happy to do that, but then I'll do another CE once the mid-year changes come out, because these are just the new year changes.
okay. I've got all my CE that I need, so I hate sitting in there for 3 hours. So just give me some points.
So fun.
You are so funny.
But yeah, and I will say for the CE, just like a heads up for y'all that are here, they won't let us give you CE credit for the new year and the mid-year changes, so you only get credit for one of them, but the full 3 CE class, I go in depth about the forms a little bit more. There, isn't time to do it in an hour to go through all the forms, really just the changes, and even then it was a little bit more than an hour, so if you need a form refresher, then certainly that's a good thing for you. But I can do this again too. I can do a CE and then a quick, here's the recap only for those of you that don't need CE. Once those come out. All right, any questions for me? Okay, well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate y'all as always.
Thank
And
you.
don't forget to put Kelly and Sonia on Facebook.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time, Ashley.
Yeah, always happy to do it.
Thank you so
Well-
much, Ashley.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Stop recording.